Thank you, Simon, and I must congratulate you for pronouncing my name, Mihir, so well. When I first became a sports journalist here, and in those days you telephoned copy, and I used to work for the Sunday Times from such exotic theatres like Old Trafford, you would ring up and say, "It's me here," and they say, "Yes, we know you're there, but who are you?" So thank you. I'm going to begin with two stories. The first is the story of my father. The next is the story of myself. And both these stories illustrate for me the aspect of migration that we just don't talk about. Helen has spoken about migration and why people have to migrate and the terrible conditions. And there are all sorts of reasons why people migrate. But the stories of migration we hear about is people coming to take your jobs, people coming to claim benefits, people coming to take your possessions, your women maybe. But actually, there's a different story of migration also. And that is people migrate for higher, idealistic reasons. That was certainly the case of my father. Let me take you back. 5th of April, 1930, a very important day. On that day, a man called Mahatma Gandhi walked more than 200 miles to Dundee on the western shore of India. His purpose was to make salt. India was then ruled by the British, and the British taxed salt, didn't allow Indians to make salt, with a huge tax on the poor. And Gandhi, who thought British rule in India was a curse, was going to make salt, break the law, seek imprisonment, arouse the Indians, and this was part of one of his campaigns, which eventually led to India's freedom. Right, well, let me take you from Dundee, 1,500 miles across the subcontinent, a long journey, almost a continent in itself, to a village which most of you probably have never heard of, Ramchandrapur, in Barisal, in what was then East Bengal, now is Bangladesh. There's my father there, sitting in the government office. Now, he is a very privileged man. He is what they call the Jamindar's son. Jamindar is the Indian word for landlord. And what is more, the firstborn, which means a lot in India. He's going to inherit vast fortune, land, village money. And what is more, my grandfather has given him this nice government job, got a lot of connections, and he knows he'll get a pension when he retires, security. You don't get sacked from government jobs. Well, at least you didn't get sacked from government jobs in India in those days. Well, let's face it, my ancestors, my father, grandfather, grandfathers were all what we would now call collaborators. The British didn't call them that, they called them loyalists. No, better word than collaborators. And they liked British rule, thought it was good for India, and had made quite a bit of money, and all that would come to my father. But as Gandhi, that little old man with a stick, is bending down to make salt, my father decides he can't work for an alien government. So what does he do? He gets up and he walks away from the job. And to the fury of his father, he then leaves his village and decides to travel right across India to join Gandhi's freedom movement. Not an easy journey. He has to take a boat, several trains, buses, and so on. Now he's left a life of privilege and pleasure. And what happens in the end? He can't join the freedom movement. He has his problems. He ends up in Bombay on the western shores. He hasn't got a job. He has to sleep on the pavements. He earns a living by translating letters from other migrants who've come to Bombay who can't read or write. That's how he earns his living. Eventually he meets the man who wants to set up a business making raincoats. It rains in India a certain month of the year. And they come up with a nice name for the raincoat company, Duck Back, like a water off a duck's back, the raincoat keeps the rain off your back, and he does quite well in the end. He brings us up, me and my sister, in great comfort, but he would have had a much cushier life had he lived in that village. And the vast wealth he would have inherited, all of which, of course, got dissipated after Indian independence and the division of the country. But he was driven by idealism. Now let me take that story 50 years forward to me. I'm in India. I am a chartered accountant. I've qualified as a chartered accountant in this country where I studied. I've gone back to India like a good, dutiful Hindu son. And I've got a very privileged life. I've got servants who are so good that they don't even allow me to carry my briefcase. If one of them was here, they would be carrying the bag you got there, the TEDx bag. It's that sort of life. There's chauffeur-driven cars. I'm a member of several clubs, and I'm a partner in a major accountancy firm. But I've had this urge to be a writer. My great hero is V.S. Naipaul, and I don't like the life in India. So I decide to leave it, come to London, And then in a rather melodramatic, almost a Bollywood-style movie fashion, I'd seen a lot of Bollywood movies, which explains my history of Bollywood, I write a very theatrical letter to my father saying, I'm resigning, not only am I resigning, but I'm such an unworthy son, he should now consider me dead. So there you are. It's a letter that will be part of my archives if anybody's interested. But nevertheless, now, imagine the situation. I don't want to over-dramatize the situation, but I come to London without a job. I don't even have a place to live. I'm camping in the living room of a friend of mine who's kindly lent it to me. I've got £400 in the bank, but for me, I couldn't become the writer that I wanted to be in India. In India, I was always part of my family circle, always my father's son. Indian society then was even more feudalistic than it is now. This country provided me the opportunity where I could be what I wanted to be, where I could write, express myself, and make my name. Now, when I came here, it's very interesting. We heard a lot about migration from Helen. I came here in 1969. I came here just months after Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, which caused a tremendous amount of controversy here. And I have watched how the immigration debate has moved in this country. And the constant refrain I hear, particularly from my right-wing friends, and I have a lot of good right-wing friends, many of them very, very good people, and particularly in the right-wing press, is that we've never talked of migration. That every time people want to talk of migration, you're branded as a racist. In fact, since 1969, I've never heard this country not talk of migration. The only problem is they talk of migration in purely economic terms. People coming here, taking our jobs away. Why are they coming here? Why aren't there restraints? Why aren't there controls? Of course, 1969 was a totally different world. When I came here, the black and white minstrel show was a great popular thing on television. And one of the most popular sitcoms was Spike Milligan, browned up to be an Indian waiter. The only words he ever said was, goodness gracious me, in a Peter Sellers accent. That explains why many years later they had a sitcom called Goodness Gracious Me, taking a completely different view. Now, this country has changed enormously since then, I think. It has changed very much for the better. It also has shown that it can provide opportunities. But what is distressing is that the story of migration, why people leave their homes, is always told in a tabloid version. People are coming here to take jobs. To leave your homeland is not an easy thing to do. It was not easy for my father in 1930. However much the idealism he felt seeing Gandhi make salt, or hearing of Gandhi make salt, there wasn't television then, there was some newsreel. But despite that, it wouldn't have been easy. And I know he broke his father's heart, just as I broke my father's heart. So, he had regret in his life as to what he did, but he had to do it. And similarly, when people leave their homelands now, they do it because they've come, they're forced to it. At times, of course, they are. They're forced to it by events. It can be famine, it can be civil war, it can be all sorts of things, torture, as we heard about from the previous speaker. But in many cases, and I and my father are not alone in this, in many cases, people leave home because they feel that another world can provide them an opportunity, not necessarily an economic opportunity, an opportunity that is better than what they have. Now, consider what my situation. Had I stayed on in India, I would now be senior partner in the accountancy firm. I would still be an accountant. I'd qualified, but it's easy to get an accountancy qualification now that I've got it. But I would have hated the job, yet I would have had a very privileged life. As a senior partner in that firm, which is now the biggest firm in India, I would have been a very rich man. I would have not had one chauffeur-driven car, but several. I've come here on the Metropolitan line, a very nice journey, but I would have, if I was going to give a speech, I would have come here with a chauffeur-driven car, with somebody holding the car door open. I had to find my own way around here. So, and friends of mine, colleagues of mine who are left behind in India, visit me regularly, and they always, I've stopped asking them how they've traveled, because I've always traveled first class. I'm a person who travels at the back of the bus hoping to get an upgrade up front. And, of course, they stay in the best hotels in London when they come. So, I would have had all that privilege. But I don't for one moment, it's almost 34 years to this month that I decided to do what I did, I have not for one moment any regret in what I did, though I haven't written anything like my hero V.S. Naipaul, or I've written a few books, and they've got the odd ripple in the pond, as it were. But I haven't achieved those great heights that I would have. But I've given it a good try. And the point is, I have done what I have done because of who I am, or because of what I represent and what I feel I could make of myself, not because of my family connections, not because I have any inherited wealth. And my story, I bet you, is not unique. My father's story is not unique. And if we are to move away from this rather narrow-focused debate on migration, which we have in this country, we have to look at these stories. We have to look at how much more nuanced migration is, how much more complex migration is, and why do people migrate? And I think one of the problems in Europe is that Europeans historically have migrated. You can find Europeans in almost every part of the world. They have remade worlds. And what is happening now as a result of changes, Europeans are not migrating, but non-Europeans are migrating into Europe, which is why this fortress Europe mentality is coming. I'm not saying it's not a problem. Whole hosts of people coming in from other countries and other cultures can be a problem. It has to be managed. But nevertheless, for the Europeans, this is a new experience. And, if you look even at firms, recall the firm, if you will, Brief Encounter, one of the great post-war firms. And how does it end? It ends with the man who has fallen in love with this woman migrating to Rhodesia. See, in those days, people were still migrating. There was the £10 POM policy that the Australian government had. If you were white, for £10 you could migrate to Australia. So, these policies were there till well into the 50s, where people in Australia and other parts of the world were looking for migrants, and Europeans were sending out their people, if you like. What is happening now? And this is the big difference. And this is where the migration story, because it is told in such simplistic terms, because it is told in such very, very tabloid version terms, does not come into account, doesn't take into account of how complex migration is and why people migrate. And of course, it does grave injustice to the memory of my father and people like him. And of course, it also distorts the whole picture of migration, and it breeds this resentment of migrants. And what it also distorts, and what it also does disservice to, and this I feel strongly, is about the country people come to. This country is a much more complex country than a simple country of being intolerant. It isn't. It's a much more complex, much more rewarding country in many ways. And I've never regretted my decision to live here. India has changed a lot, but the India that I lived in was much more of a feudalistic society. It's probably less so, but it's still a society where who you know matters much more than it does in this country. And I'm glad I came here, and by just focusing on the narrow economic zone of migration, we do it a great disservice. And I wish, I must say, I can understand how easily my media colleagues fall into this trap, but I wish they would at times take a back street and take a back step and look at it and say, the world of migration is much more complex. The story of complexity that I've narrated to you through my father and myself. Thank you.